actually had to like work really hard to get to it, like the room and changes, all sorts of crazy stuff. And it was a fantastic session that was very enlightening in terms of different ways of knowing and thinking about and conceptualizing these notions around still. Very things that I'm very much interested in. And then later on, I think it may have been the next day or later that same day, I saw that his name was on the program. I was interested in what his topic was. And I started sitting, waiting, like, where is he at? He's running late, what's going on? And the music starts. And here comes this wonderful, dynamic, young African-American scholar who just blew us away with what he had to say. And as I was sitting there, my note to self, tell Mark, we got to get him at one of our meetings. And so I'm very excited that Dr. Holly has agreed to join us. And I'll just share a little bit of his bio that you all were able to read as well. He's an assistant professor of mechanical engineering and core faculty member within the Engineering Education Research Program at the University of Michigan. He comes to us by way of Tuskegee University with a master's from Michigan State University, both in mechanical engineering, and he earned his doctorate in engineering education from Purdue University. And what I like most is the way that he situates and thinks about this thing that we call STEM. And so his research paradigm is shaped by his experiences growing up within a Black church, within a Black city, and later studying at Tuskegee University, a Black institution. And so he just brings a wealth of experience of thinking about and trying to understand this notion of Blackness as it relates to this monolith that we call STEM, that we know is very systemically raced, right? And it's problematic. And so he helps us to problematize the ways that we think about this. And so I would ask that you join me in welcoming Dr. Holly, and I hope that we will be able to see him on the screen and she's got everything worked out.
All right, good morning. We try to get this up. Folks online, are you all able to see that?
We cannot see your screen, but we can hear you well.
Okay, I think I need to share this somehow.
You go back to Zoom.
How about now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
And I know you see like, it looks like you just only see like my chin down.
Yes,
I can't say that's my
that's fine.
So back up. Yeah, I did. Well, I mean, like the camera, they basically just right here.
Oh, you got it?
Well, it's the owl. The owl is the camera.
Right.
There we go. All right. Is that better, folks online? I'll try to be still.
Perfect. Thank you.
It is hard. Yes. I like to walk around, do all type of stuff. So it kind of went out, I think. Right there. I'm going to try for the folks online to be still.
Do what you need to do.
All right. So let's get into it. Good morning. I often try to greet folks with Habari Ghani. Curious, anyone know what that means? Who is here with us today? Anyone? Online, in person? Have a good day. It's a good guess.
Habari seems like cab. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's Swahili for what's the news. but it's used kind of like how we greet each other, hello, good morning, or in Black cultural community traditions, what's up, what up though, what's good. And it's a way of checking in on someone, but also just greeting folks. So you may say that and they may spit it back to you, like, what's good, what's up, and you keep it going, or maybe like, well, I got this going on. So it could be either way, right? But the Swahili is specifically, it relates to the Black cultural holiday of Kwanzaa. Anybody familiar with Kwanzaa? All right, here we go. Right, 7-day holiday at the end of the year. And so during the time of Kwanzaa, when you say Habari Gani, what people actually respond with is the principle of the day, right? There's 7 different principles. I won't go through those, but today I want to start with this idea of Nia, which translates to purpose, right? And so Dr. Merriweather talked about my background. You all read the bio, and I just want to say that, like, today I'm not here necessarily to answer the dominant narrative questions of why we don't have certain people in STEM more broadly in higher ed. I'm more so the work and the lens through which I talk about is about purpose. And specifically, it says to make our collective vocation the building and developing of our community in order to restore our people to their traditional greatness. So the reason why I'm situated as a professor, that's my vocation. And the purpose of that is to restore Black folks to the prominence that they properly deserve and have exerted historically in various cultures and traditions, but have been suppressed within what we call the United States, which is a white supremacist social structure, right? And I'll talk about white supremacy. I know the terms get thrown around a lot. So again, just within that framework, because I may talk about things or I may not answer questions the way you would like them to be answered, or may not frame them in the way that you just traditionally used to them being framed. But this is the point I want to talk about, or the framework from which I come from. Also, the slides are very wordy. I haven't figured out how to get around just using the words that somebody else said. So, but there also is there's a lot of information on them. I'm happy to share these if that's not already made available. So they're intended to be a resource. I have citations and references. So within the time we have today, some of it I might speed up so that I can leave time for questions, but they are there. You all can get my email if you want to follow up, but the wordiness is for you to refer to later. All right, so I just want to put that up front. They're not pretty, not a whole bunch of pictures that I'll interpret for you, but that's why. So 3 main approaches, the ways I go at this. The first is just giving a primer on white supremacy. As I said before, I think the term is becoming more prominent in discourse, and it's almost as if we're understanding less about it the more it's talked about. Right. At one point in time, even the word racism was kind of taboo to use, and particularly in STEM spaces. And so now people are growing more comfortable saying the word, but yet we still don't have a shared understanding. All right. So I just talk a little bit about that. Secondarily, epistemic agency and what that means, and why I believe that's really the reason why we don't have more, not only differently looking people who represent different racial and ethnic backgrounds, but also different ideas, ways of conceptualizing, ways of knowing. I think it has more to do with epistemic agency rather than literally the tone or pigment of someone's skin. And then thirdly, making space for humanistic ways of knowing is really about the word I use more often is epistemology, to talk about knowledge and things like that. But this idea of humanistic is to say that how we currently think about STEM is not simply that it's limited or exclusive, but it really dehumanizes all of us. It reduces us to profitability, urgency, and certain things. So this is about expanding the way that now we only engage in the practice of scientific and technological knowledge, but the means and purposes, and I'm spending way too much time on this slide. But so a couple of things as I go along. One, I am in engineering, so that's through the lens of which I'll use examples, but I believe some of them can relate to other aspects of STEM, but they may not directly. Okay, so this is just a starting point that you have to do the transfer. And then secondarily, I'll talk about Blackness, right? And so there are other ways of being, cultural identities that you have to transfer. They may not be relatable. So first, get into defining terms, right? Generally, when people talk about white supremacy, this is what they think about. One who is white, right? Or identifies or racializes as white. And secondarily, is doing something that is explicitly hostile, right? So in this case, using the Confederate flag, right? There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation around the role of the Confederacy and what the Civil Wars fought. This is taken on January 6th, I think 2021, when they took over the capital. So typically people think about explicit acts of violence, but Amos Wilson defines racism and white supremacy a little bit differently. He says racism is a structural relationship. Structural. So he's not talking about me and you directly, but rather the higher level of dynamics that we exist in, based on the subordination of a racial group by another. Given this perspective, the determining feature of race relations is not prejudice towards Blacks, but rather the superior position of whites in institutions. Okay, so a lot of times when people are talking about whiteness and racism, it's about how a person who is racialized as white treats a person racialized as Black or brown or whatever the case may be. Right? Are they mean? Do they say the N-word? Do they prevent you from getting a certain position? And that stuff matters. But when we're talking about a structure and societal system, someone can coexist in a space, but this is just about that you being lower than someone else. So you could be a faculty member, but you're gonna be lower in the pay scale. You could be a faculty member, but you can't ascend or to the same level or degree in proportion to dean and provost, right? So it's not simply about a total exclusion, but it's rather, even when you're in the same context and same space, you're at a lower position. Secondarily, Dorothy Roberts in her book, Fatal Invention, describes, she says, like citizenship, race is a political system that governs people by sorting them into social groups based on invented rules. So this is not natural, this is not biological, okay? But more important, race itself is an invented political grouping. So a lot of people are like, oh, you're making it political. Yes, it already is, right? But not politics in the sense of representatives and officials, but rather politics, the basic idea of politics is governing and interactions of people, right? So a lot of stuff in our society is political, not just those who are in representative positions, right? But it says race is not a biological category that's politically charged. It is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. So when we have these injustices in this inequitable system, people rationalize that by saying, oh, it's because of some natural deficiency that this group has, or some natural advantage that another group has. And so they take the socially constructed hierarchies and try to naturalize them. So when we're moving from those definitions, okay, how does this work? There are some scholars who conceptualize what they call white supremacy culture. And so if we look at these characteristics, because a lot of times people spend more time naming and telling folks something is racist rather than explaining the mechanism and the functions of how that racism actually works. And I think that's why we don't really understand white supremacy and other ideas, because we don't really know how they function in society. It's just that don't look right, that's racist, right? Or this person is being suppressed or dehumanized. So these are some, there's I think about 16 different characteristics, but some that I highlight, I think are prominent within the academy. I think they're all in the academy, but in particular, the sense of urgency. We got to push. Anybody been in that space? We got to get this grant. We got to get this grant. Let's get this done. Let's push it out. And somebody may say, wait. I'm not sure that we're all on the same page here. Yeah, but the deadline is coming. We got to keep moving. Worship of the written word. Right? Can I get an amen on that? Right. So if we look at traditional cultures in African countries, but other communities, oral traditions are more normative or foundational. Right. So anybody familiar with the term Jali? D-J-A-I-L-I. Anybody familiar with the term? How about griot? That may be more prominent. Anybody? Griot, what's a griot? Real quick, anybody? I'm trying to be participatory, but y'all about to make me go old school lecture. I'm trying to get some participation. Help me out. Storyteller, thank you. Thank you, Brownie Point right here. So Jali is a more African-based term for using this idea of a storyteller. But it's more than just telling stories. Historically, a Jali can tell you the ancestry of a group given people in a particular tribe or village. And so there's not this meticulous record keeping. It is about that individual. And what they do is not all about like if they die, everything's dead. It is their responsibility to train the next generation's Jali and storyteller. And so when we come to a context, I like to write, like written handwriting as well as typing. But if we come to a context where the undeniable, verifiable way of sharing knowledge is the written word, you put certain groups at a disadvantage if they make sense of things in different ways, particularly if the language that they are forced to use is not one that can fully translate their way of sense making, right? So this is not about demeaning the written word. but it should be one mechanism, one medium of many, right? I even struggle with this. I can go and give talks all day long, but when it's time to sit down and write, I have to, okay, how do I communicate this idea in the same way that my word, because writing and talking are different skill sets, right? And so I don't mind working through that, but some of us have not either been trained or supported, but in other ways, even if we don't have those skills or don't desire to have them or are working on them, we treat the difference of skill sets and interests as a deficiency, as opposed to an alternative method of communicating information. Objectivity, we're going to get to that later, in the belief in one right way. So first, I want to, again, I'm not even getting to STEM yet. This is just in general, this social structure. Another way to identify whiteness and white supremacy is by presenting an alternative way of viewing things. So it's not simply about naming what white supremacy and what's wrong with that, critiquing that. At some point, even if we did away with that in some imaginative way, what will we do next? And so we also must understand other ways of viewing the world in society. So Cornel West, in his article he wrote in 1973, he said, Blacks need the kind of knowledge that flows from the subtle rationality of seriously committed intellectuals who have the enhancement of Blacks foremost on their minds. And so one, in this, I highlight a couple of things. One, he says seriously committed intellectuals. So that's why we're here talking about the professoriate, right? As much as folks talk about getting degrees, Dr. Merriweather and I were talking last night about how unfortunate it is that so much about students getting degrees and majors is to get a job, right? And that's a very practical concern from Detroit, single parent home, lower middle class. And so understanding the need to provide for family, provide for oneself, we need money and resources. But how sad it is that we make everything about the society in terms of something that you can practically do to earn money. And so even the academy, higher education, has been minimized to, it's only worthwhile if you can translate this into some specific pay scale, right? And we got away from this idea of intellectualism, knowledge, not necessarily just for knowledge's sake, but so that we can make sense of the world and better interact with one another. So seriously committed intellectuals, but second, who have the enhancement of Blacks foremost on their minds. That is no minor thing. We have people who are Black people. Then you have folks who care about Black people. And then you have other folks who everything that they do is to enhance the social standing of Black people. That's a very different spectrum, right? And so what he's saying is we need to make space for those who are thinking politically, socially, economically, philosophically around not just can I get you in this space, but how do I make sure that you're in these academic spaces and well? How do I make sure that you have self-determination in these spaces, right? And so this is an alternative way. And so again, these are something you can refer back to later, but I showed that this is not just one way of doing this. There are many scholars in general, intellectuals who are not seen as traditional scholars. Fred Hampton, probably people wouldn't refer to him as a scholar, but if you look at the work that he did prior to his assassination, he's a very intellectual gentleman. But I also have folks more in the traditional academy, Dr. Gloria Laskin-Billings, Carter G. Woodson. And so if you look at the work of these scholars, you'll see that there are different ways that frame how we enhance Black people's reality. Some are seeking liberation more broadly. Some are looking at womanism, which can also be referred to as Black feminism, right? Afrocentrism, this is something that's growing. And so again, I won't dig into these, but just to show there are various ways that people are framing alternative realities or what could be and how we make sense of something other than what we have today. So now transitioning into epistemic agency. And so epistemic, this word, Greek word that basically, and this is dictionary.com, so I'm not trying to be fancy here, right? Like this, you can look this up, of or relating to knowledge or the conditions of acquiring. But again, that is what the professoriate is about, at least in my understanding, right? And so there are many ways, the classes that we take, who the professors are, their way of presenting information, research methods and practices, research aims. All of these things are related to epistemology. So epistemic oppression, and that you can't see the reference, but it's there by Dr. Christy Dotson, a colleague of mine actually at the University of Michigan, says epistemic oppression refers to a persistent and unwarranted infringement on the ability to utilize persuasively shared epistemic resources that hinders one's contributions to knowledge production. So try to slow down. Much of the rationale for the framing for why we don't have more Black people per se, Black professors or Black people in certain professions, is falls under this term of underrepresentation. How many people have heard underrepresentation? All right, I expected 100%, right? Leave the head nod. The hand up, right? So what that says is, right, there's a problem because the percentage of a certain identity group within a respective profession, it does not have parity with their demographic representation, right? On its own, may not necessarily seem problematic. But what I argue is what that does is focuses on the numbers and statistical representation while ignoring how do we even get there. So then the focus becomes how can we increase these numbers rather than how can we change the structures and ways of existing that made the numbers so low to begin with, right? It allows people to ignore the fact that this, you know, the original sin was not chattel slavery. It was killing indigenous people who were here, right? And taking over there. That was the original sin of what we now call the United States. And then chattel slavery followed, where we, you know, not we, I had nothing to do with it, but people kidnapped, you know, African folks, brought them over here, enslaved them, used their labor to build an economic system, right? That then they developed a governance system that is still in place today. We ignore that. And then even when they shut down that system, they created this racial segregation system, which we refer to as Jim Crow, right? And then even when that system was reduced, then you had mass incarceration, right? So there's all these system and structures that, I mean, I should only focus on the academy, I'm sorry. So even the academy, when a lot of these schools were created, Black people and some others could not attend. That explicitly hampers the numbers of representation. I might want to go into the field, I might want to study, but you're not allowing me to give me a chance. So either I'm gonna do something else, right? Or I'm gonna try to find my own way. And so even when, you know, alternative institutions and historically Black institutions were developed, the resources weren't the same that were allocated. In fact, there's a book called Race, Rigor, and Selectivity, the History of Occupational, I messed up the last part, but there was Race, Rigor, and Selectivity by Amy Slayton. She talks about how in the Maryland academic system, the resources that were supposed to go to Black institutions were given to the leader of the white institution, University of Maryland. And he was put in charge of allocating, reallocating those resources to Black schools, right? So when we're talking about why the numbers why there's not parity, we have to really sit with the structure that led to the minimal presence. And I'm not even getting to the interpersonal dynamic, right? Walk into a classroom, oh, sorry, you in the right place? You know, demeaning people's contributions. We're gonna get to that later, but like before we even start there, we have to look at these broader structures. So underrepresentation, it preserves whiteness because whiteness is not held accountable. And again, by whiteness, I'm not necessarily talking about white people. By Blackness, I'm not necessarily talking about Black people. I'm talking about historical ideas, values, and practices by that particular group of people, right? And so whiteness says that I'm going to remove accountability and place it on you to work hard to get into this space that I never really made a space for you, you know, context and culture for you to be welcome in, to contribute. So epistemic oppression is a framing that I use to say what we once visualized and knew and understood as physical oppression has now evolved into how we think about knowledge. All right, so walk in the classroom, nobody is getting, I shouldn't say nobody, because not often are people getting hit, physically hit or whipped or beat. Right, the same visually brutalizing type of imagery. Many people, that's how we think about oppression. It's like, you know, or we think about in other countries where they don't have a constitutional representative governing system, where, you know, you have dictators who make decisions and all type of corruption that's more explicit. So we think about oppression as that when there's visibly there are things that aren't right, where in this society it's much more covert. Right. So I think when you talk about epistemic oppression, this one is persistent and unwarranted infringement. So this is not a one-time thing. This is not the first time somebody shows up in your class, or the first time they submit a grant that one time they didn't get support. This is an ongoing process of being denied the opportunity to contribute to knowledge. And this other part is being prevented from utilizing persuasively shared epistemic resources. How do we know what we know? And I'll get to that a little bit later, but people are trying to use the same resources that other folks are using, but it's not being translated or appreciated the same way. So there's three different dynamics of how it works. One is testimonial justice, right? You all can guess, it's not meant to be tricky. Testimony, right? Somebody's witness, their word. So not valuing someone's word. Second, hermeneutical is interpretation, right? Generally, hermeneutics is used in terms of biblical text, religious text. How do you interpret what is being said, right? So in this case, it's about how the lens that which people use to make sense of their experience. So this is my word, what you said, your perspective, your point that you're being made is not appreciated. But secondarily, how you interpret what you said happened. We were all here today. And when we leave, someone asks, oh, what happened today? Well, you say one thing, I say this happened. In this context, we're not fighting. We don't, at least not yet. But in the classroom dynamic, right? A student raises their hand, they give their perspective, or they're sitting in class, and another student, they're working in a team member, particularly in engineering, right? There's a lot of teamwork, team-based projects. And so the students go off in a group, and you get the end product. And the student said, well, I contributed this, I tried this, but they weren't listening to me. The student said, no, well, what you're saying didn't make sense. Who do we believe? So this is hermeneutical, right? As someone is interpreting what happened to them, what happens a lot of times, well, they didn't mean that, right? When Black students are telling us what's going on in classrooms and outside of classrooms, and well, maybe they weren't trying to do that. So we went from, not we, again, I don't do this. People went from explicitly denying it to shifting and focusing on intent. That wasn't their intent. Like with certainty, first of all, we don't know what anyone else's intent is, even if they say it's one thing or another, right? But that becomes the mechanism by which we deny and oppress other folks. Is we take this standpoint that they couldn't have. I know this person. They couldn't have intended to do that. And so we minimize the harm that's caused, right? And again, I'm still in the knowledge domain, right? So somebody gave feedback on a paper, on a grant. Well, they didn't mean, but maybe they didn't. And we're making all the, or people are making all these excuses. And then the third part is, so the first two come from a scholar who talks about epistemic injustice. I think it's Marie Fricker. I know her last name is Fricker. I might have messed up her first name. But the third one is an addition by Christy Dotson. And she says a positional injustice. Well, she doesn't use that term. I made that term up. But what she talks about is the first two are interpersonal, testimonial, and hermeneutical. But the third is systemic. So that's the one that's already baked into, going back to what I talked about earlier, how institutions were developed, how disciplines were developed, right? A lot of our disciplines, science and engineering, were developed, formalized, I should say, while Black folks were still enslaved, or while slavery, I guess, was still in existence, I should say, because not everyone was enslaved, right? And so what does that mean about the formations of the discipline? A lot of scientific disciplines were developed by trying to prove that Black people were inferior. And folks still use those methods of meaning making in current research, even for different purposes, right? And so when we're looking at the systemic dynamics of the origins of these disciplines and what they were intended to do, even as we use them for new purposes, they still have implications on our meaning making and who can contribute and the value of their contribution. So these are the different mechanisms. And so again, real quick, testimonial justice is unfairness related to trusting someone's word, hermeneutical, how people interpret their lives, and then thirdly, devaluing people's potential status as knowers. So let's move into this next part. How do we then, what can we do about these dynamics, right? Again, that last part was just a framing that I give, and now we can look at what I do, ways I try to make sense of this. And I like this image because in the STEM disciplines, we have this normative way of sense making. Well, I should say in engineering sciences, we lean on logical positivism. Anyone familiar with that term? Logical positivism. And sorry, folks online, I can't see you. So if you raise your hand, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, but and so logical positivism, just in short, centers on this experiential. I don't know if the court, yeah, right here, right? Go into a lab, and that which I can test, and the results of that test is what is valid. That which I can validate through tests and experimentation, I should say. Right, so spiritual, mythic or mystic, those don't have any space or any legitimacy in terms of how we make sense of things, right? So we can say, okay, those are the norms and the guidelines and structures. Well, then what happens when you have a group where it's not necessarily, I mean, it's a choice, but it's also a historical and cultural way of meaning making by centering spirituality. It's not simply a religious practice. It's a way in which they make sense of the world. Well, when you come into a domain that the only legitimate ways of making sense of experimentalism, they may participate because that's how they have to achieve success, but they're never fully there and engaged, right? And what they're doing, they're actually even pretending that it's a method of assimilation because they pretend to engage in, and that's why for you, not for you personally, but like for a person who operates in the experiential standpoint, somebody who operates in the spiritual and mythic, you might say, this doesn't make sense. It may be always something missing or lacking, but it's not because of them personally, it's because they're trying to fit into your structure. Right? They're taking their way of existence, their ontology, and even epistemology and saying, okay, if I got to get through here, I got to leave that in this space. Now let me try to take up this way of doing things. And so if it doesn't fit, that's why. It's not because of any intellectual deficiency. Right? So in my work, and this says, I don't know how to get it. Let me just look at this, I guess, and then, okay, thanks for that. So this is the term I'm working with, like pro-Black engineering education research. Again, that's the space I'm in, but let me pick up pace a little bit. So anybody familiar with this book, My People? Photography book. Anybody familiar with the poem, My People by Langston Hughes? All right, there we go. So the book was based on the poem by Langston Hughes. Charles R. Smith just took pictures of Black people, like smiling, existing, just being. And so in I think the afterword or the foreword, I don't know which one. He said, Langston Hughes' words were not meant to dismiss other races, just to celebrate his own. Right. So again, this is going back to Cornel West. Like we need people who are seriously committed to enhancing Black people. And so in today's society, saying anti-Black is becoming more and more normalized. But to say pro-Black is like everybody shut down. Oh, you're trying to usurp white supremacy with Black supremacy, right? And it's like, no, we're just trying to actually humanize and recognize the dignity of this group that has already been dehumanized in their respective place, right? So this idea of centering on my people, not really trying to dismiss others, but trying to expose and really make visible the ways in which our people have demonstrated dignity. That is what frames my work. And then secondarily, a book by Dr. Ebony McGee, Black, Brown, Bruised, How Racialized STEM Education Stifles Innovation. She asked this question, which I think is so poignant. She said, what contributions can Black, Latin, and Indigenous peoples offer to STEM disciplines that no other groups of people can? And so what I argue the problem with why we don't have more people, because we're not making space to answer this question. We're not asking what can you, one who exists in a different cultural norm and way of making sense of things, what you who have existed on the lower end of the social structure and hierarchy, who have had to exist and persist and resist in many ways, and yet you're still here. We can track, we can go, we can go ask the history folks all the things that have happened, but folks are still here in being successful in spite of, not to the degree that we want. I don't want to dismiss the very still present suffering, but in spite of all, it could have been so much worse. And so instead of asking these groups, how do you do all this stuff in spite of all that was done to you, we're still forcing, we in the academy are still forcing people to adapt to whiteness. And so we're missing out on these truly novel ideas that could exist, new ways of using science and technological information. And so one way that we can make space is disabusing ideology. And so Aaron Seck, professor also at Michigan, and I'm not biased towards University of Michigan people. I didn't know these people were at Michigan when I was like following their ideas. It just worked out that way. But she says the first important ideology within the culture of engineering is the notion that engineering is a purely technical domain. How many people heard that? Or science or technology, right? And thus asocial and apolitical. Because science and mathematics knowledge is understood to be the basis of engineering expertise, engineering work is assumed to be carried out objectively and without bias. So let me just say this so y'all know where I stand, right? STEM, more broadly, engineering in particular, has never been objective. And it never will be, because we are human beings who do the work. So even if the numbers themselves are objective, the way that we use the numbers, we make sense of the numbers. My interpretation can very well be different. Now, there are ways that we can reduce subjectivity, right? So you not think I'm totally crazy. I think there are ways that, but we first got to acknowledge where our subjectivity plays a role. And we just say we're being objective, we can never accurately identify where our subjectivity is and work to minimize or not exclude, but like minimize. Okay, so just, and we can talk about that. But when we look at Black intellectuals, and this is again, folks in STEM, folks outside, they tell us a few things. You know, we talk about a meritocracy, well, education is political. So again, I'm not going to explain where these come from. This is just a presentation of an alternative to how the field talks about things. And when we look at other ways of knowing how they counter. So positivism is just about experimentation, but Black intellectualism will show us that teacher positionality matters, right? So again, we can all be teaching the same science class, but naturally we're going to approach that way of engaging the class differently. Now, if we are doing and saying the same things, that's unnatural. That means some of us have been elevating the firm in our way of knowing as the right way and the standard, and the rest of us have adapted to that. I want to get to questions, so I'm gonna spin this a little bit real quick. So I talked about positivism. An alternative is interpretivism, right? So positivism has these ideas that like society shapes the individual. People's actions can generally be explained by the social norms they have been exposed to through their socialization. So it really takes a lot of the agency out of someone's existence and being the way of knowing, whereas interpretivism says individuals have consciousness and are not just puppets who react to external social forces, right? They are intricate and complex, and different people experience and understand the same objective reality in different ways. And so these are the ways that, like, again, when you're in a STEM course, generally they're not telling you, hey, we affirm positivism, right? This is how we make sense of things. But many scholars, particularly in the paper I just read, show that this is the way that rationalization and justification, if you have an argument, right, you come up with different findings, how do you win that argument? You justify it. It's usually along these rationalistic lines, using quantitative research over qualitative research, right? That's one that is more prominent, we're familiar with. The second way is recognizing systems, and I'm gonna push through this, but in general, it's just saying that, as I talked about earlier, it's not just about people and individuals, it's about recognizing the structural dynamics that people are navigating, right? And so that's another way that we can make space for humanizing knowledge, is we recognize that a Black person coming and getting to college, there's so much they had to get through beyond the classroom. When they're seeing people who also racialized as Black get murdered with impunity, right? When they're navigating Black ghettos that we know are under-resourced, because we all using the term underserved, under-resourced. We say it like it's not a problem anymore, right? We name them by that. I want to go to underserved people. And then I just wonder, like, we so comfortable, like, if we all know that under-resourced, if we're all acknowledging that now, why don't we give the resources? Why don't we address that problem? As opposed to just now we're all admitting that that is the case, right? And so this is just recognizing that those things have a real influence. And then thirdly, recognizing that the inclusion is not enough. Right, so when we name the fact that weed out culture is still alive and well, though not as prominent, but most of STEM is about how do you see who doesn't deserve to be there, as opposed to how do we make space for folks who want to be there, right? So when you recognize that, you see that affinity groups, like, and it's like groups like NSBE, National Society of Black Engineers, you know, or whatever the racial group in your respective community or discipline, they help students survive, but they don't necessarily help them be well. Okay, so inclusion only allows you to be in the space, right? We got different colors and pigmentations because we have grown in inclusion, but it don't mean that we're all appreciated and seen the same within the space. And so when we look at Blackness, you actually see an aspiration for something higher than just having a seat at the table. That's low level, you know what I mean? That's the base. Like, I get that as a right, right? And so that's also how we make space. I'm trying to wrap up. I'm gonna close. So again, this is stuff you all can see in there. I guess lastly, I'll just hit on 3 things. that I feel like is, and I know the AGEP fellows, at least my understanding is that you all already are faculty, and this community more broadly is looking at how do we support other students. So I think there are 3 ways in your own teaching, but also in mentoring that you can work through. And so representation, I think a lot of times representation is just about showing faces of differently raced people, right? So who did this first? Who did that first? And what I think it needs to be about, one, parity in representation. So instead of just showing one super Negro, right, show the wealth of many people who are doing things. As much as we name we have this dichotomy where white folks are named on the equation. So you got to speak it whether or not you want to, right? But then Black people every now and then get cherry picked and say, hey, this person did something, but what did they contribute? What knowledge did they provide? Right, we got folk legends in here, right? Retirees, what knowledge they provide? How do we elevate that? Not only just their name. Secondarily, that means physical representation. So not only putting a picture up and saying this person did this, but hiring these people and seeing them as knowers within the academy. Another one is information, right? So this is a framework from a paper. It talks about engineering. Again, I'm talking about engineering specifically. It's not just about technical information and math and science. It's also about the social sciences. We engineer as people, with people, and for people. And so we need to have information and understanding how people interact, what things contribute to certain people's perceptions and perspectives. And so changing or reclaiming this idea that engineering is socio-technical. It's inherently both social and technical. You can't just be one without the other. You can focus on one and diminish the other, right? And you'll be very successful in that. But at its base, is all of STEM is inherently socio-technical. And then the last one is application. And so this is a way where we can support students in terms of how they want to use the knowledge that they are gaining. A lot of times we're looking at knowledge and research and information to, you know, develop buildings or make stronger structures. And this is what that quote by Ebony McGee was getting at. She's like, a lot of students, particularly non-white students, come into these spaces wanting to make impact in their home communities. This is not always the case, right? So I'm not saying when you see a Black student, like, I know you want to help your community, I'm going to help you do that. Not everybody necessarily wants to do that. We are human beings, right? Allow us to be human. Some want to focus on equity issues, some don't. Some want to get paid and rich just like other people, right? But there's a higher propensity because they are more, the reality of oppression is more prominent to them. And so their desire to get out and be successful and make a change, there's a higher likeliness because they understand what it means not to have, to be without, to be disenfranchised, right? And so a lot of times it's not necessarily that certain equations that are racist in themselves. It's rather how do we use the information, what are the means and purposes and the ways in which the information is being applied. So I'll stop there to try to leave some time for questions. I know we tight on the schedule, but thank you for your attention. Yep.
You spoke about the fact that